webinar focuses on preparing teacher candidates to translate high leverage practices into remote environments. So welcome to this webinar. It's presented by me, Dr. Shannon Budin, and also my colleagues from Buffalo State University, Drs. Andrew Hashey, Angela Patti, and Lisa Rafferty. We're members of the Exceptional Education Department, where we prepare teachers in a variety of certification areas, including special education, bilingual education, TESOL, and applied behavior analysis. Our preparation programs prioritize preparing teachers to engage in and use effective, evidence-based teaching practices. So today, we are going to share some insight and a few tips related to how we envision preparing teachers to use those very effective and high leverage practices when they find themselves teaching in remote environments. In 2020 and 2021, we did not stop preparing teachers, nor did schools stop educating students. And as we all know by now, because of the global pandemic, instruction certainly looked a little different, but we were all in the same business of trying to prepare profession-ready teachers, even if the settings and the delivery models looked a little different. My colleagues and I at Buffalo State University recognized that the very high leverage practices that we wanted our teacher candidates to learn and to demonstrate could actually still be applied even in remote environments. We looked at the core foundational concepts present in the HLPs, and we wrote this paper. It was published in the Journal of Special Education Preparation in 2021, and it illustrated how faculty could really translate those HLPs into remote teaching environments when preparing candidates. So even though the pandemic is behind us, remote instruction, even in smaller and less frequent forms, is really here to stay. So whether it's needed for a student with medical needs or due to a change in placement brought on by maybe weather-related school closings, or to allow access to services for students in shortage areas or rural settings, even when using flipped learning as a pedagogical approach, all of these potential scenarios illustrate that when preparing teachers, we should consider preparing them for a range of instructional environments, including online. So although many educator preparation programs are offered online, they generally prepare teachers with the assumption that those teachers will be working in face-to-face brick and mortar classrooms. So despite this assumption, we as educators can and should take time to explore the practices and pedagogies designed for traditional environments and consider how they might translate to remote environments. My colleagues and I suggest that even though HLPs were designed with face-to-face instruction in mind, it's reasonable to assume that many of the critical attributes of these practices can impact teaching and learning in remote environments as well. So it is possible that some of those same effective high leverage practices can be enacted in a range of settings. So after all, we know that HLPs are simply teaching practices that are used often, they're used broadly across curricular instructional approaches. We know they're research-based and that they can improve student achievement, and we know that they're teachable to novices who can learn more about how to help their students while teaching. And we believe that also those same practices can hold true even when teachers find themselves teaching remotely. So in our paper, we offer 5 tips that teacher education faculty can employ in their own courses to help candidates translate those HLPs into remote environments. So our goal was really to illustrate sort of a systematic model of preparation where the essence of each HLP is really not lost, and rather the most salient features of that practice are identified and translated for use in either synchronous or asynchronous online instruction. So we designed an instructional sequence that we think would help ensure that they really understand not just what to do, but why they're doing it. And we emphasize the rationale for instructional decision-making instead of trying to teach just a plethora of new technology tools that could really vary school to school. They could become quickly outdated. So rather, our tips are just meant to be general, regardless of the technology tools used. The tips that we think that a faculty member can consider are first to identify target HLPs and their key components, then compare what those HLPs look like when instructing in different modalities, then of course model and remote instruction with teacher candidates, and also provide practice opportunities with those HLPs in remote instruction too. And then finally, they can explore the technology that they can use to support those HLPs without heavy emphasis on specific tools. So, of course, we refer you to the revised edition of the HLPs, the ones for students with disabilities. They're available from CEC, but also for free in a PDF format from the Cedar Center as a source for our example today. So in our paper, we zeroed in on two specific HLPs to illustrate how an instructor could employ these 5 tips when preparing teachers to use effective teaching practices, even in remote environments. We emphasize HLP 7, which is establishing a consistent, organized, and respectful learning environment, and also HLP 18, using strategies to promote active student engagement. So to get started, our first tip for faculty to identify target HLPs and key components is focused on the instructional HLPs specifically. So we want to examine the HLP closely and really pull out those active ingredients or sort of those kernels that are essential to success. So in other words, what are the key elements that truly make the implementation of an HLP successful? So for example, in reviewing HLP 7, an instructor would want candidates to really understand that a consistent, organized, and respectful learning environment would be full of clear expectations, routines, and procedures. And so that those expectations, routines, and procedures could also be explicitly taught. So what might that look like in remote instruction? Well, to start, it might look very similar to how you would prepare teachers to use HLPs in typical face-to-face environments. But to think about it remotely, we're going to shift to tip number 2. So tip number 2 states that we would like to compare HLPs and what they look like when instructing in different modalities. So for example, as part of HLP 7, we would want teacher candidates to identify classroom situations that really call for a specific routine or a specific procedure, like maybe asking for assistance in the middle of a lesson, or when and how they leave the room to use the bathroom, or where do they put their work when it's finished. So those are routines and procedures, but candidates would want to think about and then task analyze to develop those routines and procedures, not just in a typical classroom, but what might vary or be different when teaching remotely, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous. So in their book, Explicit Instruction, Archer and Hughes offer many examples of classroom situations that need routines and procedures. We just extended those to bring in considerations for online modalities. So for example, when teaching students to transition to a new activity in a face-to-face environment, a teacher might do something like provide some sort of verbal or visual cue or auditory signal to a student that, hey, it's time to transition. And then they might remind them of those expectations, such as how much time was allotted. They might tell them what level their voice could be at during that transition. But if we're instructing in an online video conference type format, there still might be verbal or visual or even auditory prompting, as well as a reminder of expectations. However, those expectations would vary. So in a video conference, if students were transitioning to a new activity, the routine might be, hey, close out a window on the computer, or now it's time to click on a new link. Maybe there are specific steps or expectations on how to join a breakout room following the whole group instruction, and also maybe what to do once you're in the breakout room. So compared to face-to-face class, a student might not have to be reminded about their voice level during transitions, but they might have to be reminded about things like muting or unmuting their microphone and what are the procedures and expectations. They might have to learn when the chat box can be used during the instructional activity versus blurting out a question or response, or maybe when to use a digital hand raising feature. In an asynchronous instructional setting, there may not be the same verbal or auditory signals, but the teacher might use a visual checklist for module tasks to help the students know what order to complete things or when and where to find the assignments, where to see drop boxes or assignment resources. Maybe it involves a visual progress bar that provides insight on the completion of each activity to help that student really monitor their movement from one activity to the next. Perhaps a student is required to print out an activity list and self-check as they move through their online module. The point here is that teachers recognize what aspects of the classroom, be it in person or online, that require routines, procedures, and expectations, and then just explicitly teach those routines, procedures, or expectations. So thus, when it comes to creating a consistent, organized, and respectful learning environment, The modality may change, but the salient and impactful features of effective teaching practices never change. We know that routines and procedures should be identified, they should be planned, and they should be explicitly taught. And another example, part of HLP 18, is to emphasize the need for a variety of instructional strategies that result in active student responding, including technology-based approaches. So in a face-to-face class, that might be a web-based poll or quiz like Socrative or Mentimeter. When getting on a virtual collaboration tool, maybe it would be something like a bulletin board like Padlet, where students can post ideas and images in response to a question. They can reflect on a reading. They can engage in a brainstorming session. These types of tools would translate easily to remote teaching environments. However, other lower tech face-to-face responding techniques could be more challenging in a remote environment. So for example, things like using unison choral responding when teaching in a synchronous online format may not be feasible, but an instructor could model examples of other unison responding techniques, such as unison nonverbal feedback, like showing a physical thumbs up or holding up a dry erase board with responses at the same time, or maybe asking candidates to hold up 1, 2, 3, or 4 fingers to respond to multiple choice questions. So students could be taught to respond through reaction icons also, and maybe some of the other annotation tools on the video conference. They could even use something like a chat waterfall technique, where everyone enters in their short answer all at once, and then the chat box populates in a visual waterfall of words. All of these types of responding and active engagement techniques take on the salient aspects of active student responding, and they illustrate how it could still take place remotely. In an asynchronous modality, enacting key features of HLP 18 is still feasible. Students can engage through the use of maybe a shared or collaborative document where they have individual roles and responsibilities, and maybe by responding even to like embedded questions on an instructional video, for example. But to most instructors, these are common practices anyway when teaching. But the point here that we're really trying to emphasize is that we can overtly teach our candidates that these practices can also be representative of those critical features of HLPs, and that they should really start to recognize that carryover. It should come to no surprise that tip 3 and 4 emphasize modeling and practice for our teacher candidates. The assumption that candidates will see carryover of what they traditionally do in face-to-face for those expectations is not intrinsic, and they may not just generalize it or apply them to remote teaching environments, and that's just not practical. So in our paper, we offer a case study of a faculty member that illustrates how that faculty member went through this process of examining the HLPs, selecting key features for remote instruction, modeling and providing opportunities to the candidates, and also providing practice and feedback. So for the sake of time and space of this webinar, we hope that you will explore this case study that's published in the Journal of Special Ed Preparation, that paper, and we hope that you will gain more insight as to what that could look like in your own preparation program. Tip 5 states that faculty should prepare candidates to explore technology that can support the enactment of HLPs, but to do so judiciously and not be sidetracked by the newest or the brightest or the most popular tools, but rather to really approach digital tool exploration with a level of discernment that keeps their pedagogical value at the forefront. So in other words, candidates need to be able to explain why these tools might be beneficial in remote teaching and learning, and also how they support those high leverage practice teaching techniques. So noticing that the evidence-based attributes that make them effective are still present even when using those technology tools. Herberger and colleagues provide an excellent resource that candidates should explore that really offers tips for digital tool selection and makes key points such as keeping the number of tools limited and manageable, and of course, explicitly teaching and modeling the tool use and ensuring that the accessibility features are included. To summarize, we know that teachers must be prepared to teach in a range of settings, might include face-to-face as well as various online modalities. And to help ensure our teacher candidates recognize that high leverage practices that these teaching practices aren't confined to the four brick and mortar walls of a school building, we as teacher educators must be purposeful in making the connection between the most salient features of HLPs and how they could and should be enacted in remote environments. So we invite you to read our case study in Joseph and hope that it sparks some ideas of what that might look like for you and your candidates.